Good day. Today is Monday, 19th May 2025, and as you can see, I am in my hotel room in St. Petersburg, taking a break from the legal forum which I'm currently attending here in St. Petersburg. I've only been here a few hours, but I've already made a contribution to one of the panels. I expect to be making a further contribution to a second panel tomorrow, and I expect to be attending some panels by others as well. At some point, probably tomorrow, I will be, for a short time, a very short time, visiting the city, but it will be a visit that will have to involve a quick look around by myself of the situation in the city because of the very tight schedule. I'm unfortunately not going to have the time to meet friends and people in St. Petersburg. It is essentially an attempt to try and find out what the general state of things in St. Petersburg is, to get a sense of the condition of the economy, of the way in which life is progressing, continuing in Russia at this time. I will, on that topic now, just briefly give my very preliminary view. The first is that if you do travel at all in Russia, at least in the part of the short period of time I've been in Russia, you see no visible or obvious signs either of the war or of the sanctions. No doubt all of that is there under the surface, but on the surface this absolutely looks like a nation at peace, and this is my next point, a nation which is considerably richer than it was 7 years ago when I was last here. Obviously, this is a superficial impression made after just a few hours in the country. I will supplement it with a more detailed impression after I have been to St. Petersburg tomorrow. But my overall impression, at least at the present time, is that there has been a considerable rise in the standard of living since in the 7 years since I was last here in 2018. This despite the fact that we've been through the period of COVID and all of that all is obviously behind us, but it disrupted the progress of the economy in Russia as it did in many other places. And yet, in spite of all of that, as I said, my overall impression, my sense is that the country is very considerably wealthier and better off than it was when I last saw it. Anyway, let's move to the topics that I will discuss in this program. And I'm afraid, again, because of the time pressures, this program is going to be short. Briefly, later today, there is due to be a telephone call between President Donald Trump of the United States and President Putin of Russia. After the call, Trump is apparently intending to speak to Zelensky to discuss, presumably, what happened over the course of the call with Putin and the progress of the negotiations in Istanbul. Trump is also talking about speaking with other NATO leaders over the course of the next couple of days. Now, there's been much speculation and discussion about what this call is about, and Trump himself has been writing about it on Truth Social. He still is talking about a ceasefire, and that, I think, has to be a concerning sign, but he's still talking about a ceasefire. But the tone of his comment on Truth Social was determinedly optimistic, that he seems to think that things are moving forward in the right direction towards a peace settlement. I'm not entirely sure what the source of his optimism is, because as far as I can see, the Russians are not shifting their position at all, and neither are the Ukrainians. However, There has been an article in the American Conservative by Jennifer Gallagher which says that the talks in Istanbul should be considered a success. And contrary to practically every other commentary that you will see, apart from that one, I actually lean more to that view than otherwise. This is a very complex, unfolding conflict. There is an awful lot to work through. The situation on the battlefronts remains highly fluid. When I say it is highly fluid, I should perhaps correct that. The Russians are advancing all the time in every location. They have been advancing further and faster over the last 24 hours since I made my previous video. So the Russians are continuing to advance. So it is fluid, but fluid in one direction. And that inevitably is going to shape and put pressure on the progress, if one could call it that, of the peace talks. But anyway, this is a complex process. The situation, the actual situation, is changing dynamically all the time. It is completely unsurprising, given the absolute chasm that exists between Russia and Ukraine, between the Putin government and the Maidan government in Kiev. It is completely unsurprising that the two parties were not able to agree on very much over the course of a first meeting, which lasted for just 2 hours. It is a mistake to expect that they would, and it is an absolute mistake to pitch the expectations as high as some people in Europe are currently doing. Now, this is where the topic of the ceasefire comes into play, because ever since the talks in Istanbul ended, we have had an orchestrated narrative pouring out of Europe and Kiev that the talks were a failure, that the fact that the Russians aren't agreeing to an unconditional ceasefire shows that they were a failure. This, of course, completely disregards the fact that the Russians have repeatedly said that they're not in the business of agreeing to unconditional ceasefires. Anyway, that the ceasefire was, that the talks were a failure because no unconditional ceasefire was agreed. Keir Starmer talks about the Russians still stringing President Trump along. Friedrich Merz says that the talks were a disappointment because the Russians have shown no movement at all in their positions. Things of that kind. To repeat again, no one should expect a breakthrough moment, a decisive agreement to a complex conflict of this kind out of a single meeting. The most important thing is that the meeting in Istanbul does appear, at least for the moment, to be part of a process. The Russians and the Ukrainians met. They didn't agree on any of the key issues. The Russians, as they have consistently done, rejected the idea of a ceasefire outright, an unconditional ceasefire outright. They repeated Putin's point from the 14th of June 2024, when he made this speech to the foreign ministry, that the Ukrainians, in order to secure a ceasefire, need to commit to pulling their troops out of the 4 regions. This is, as I said, a long-standing Russian position. If we do get to discussions of a ceasefire, the Russians will no doubt bring up many of the further conditions that Putin laid out over the course of his telephone conversation with Donald Trump on the 18th of March. Who will monitor the ceasefire? What guarantee is there that Ukraine won't use any period of the ceasefire to re-equip and reinforce its positions and to basically try to stabilize the situation in which it is losing and losing badly. All of this from the Russians was completely to be expected. And it makes no sense to be surprised or pretend to feign surprise or anger that the Russians didn't just go to that meeting in Istanbul and agree to the ceasefire that the Ukrainians now, who are obviously losing the war, emphatically need and which the Americans want. Simply because the Ukrainians need it and the Americans want it doesn't mean that the Russians must agree to it. I would have thought that was obvious, though it seems to be lost on many people. Anyway, saying that because the Russians didn't agree to an unconditional ceasefire on the first day of a series of meetings due to happen in Istanbul, when they have, of course, always rejected the kind of ceasefire that has been talked about and which is being discussed, is not just ridiculous, it is fundamentally dishonest. None of the people who are talking in this way, not Macron, not Starmer, not Merz, not Tusk, not the worthies of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and all of the others, can seriously have believed that the Russians would go to that meeting in Istanbul and agree to the ceasefire proposal that they had previously rejected. But to repeat again, that doesn't mean the talks failed. It was a first meeting. The sides agreed to exchange written ceasefire plans that will, of course, reveal the extent of the gulf between them, but it will give them a topic to discuss at future meetings and perhaps to take forward as the situation on the battlefield changes and as more and more of the remaining territory of the four regions which the Ukrainians still control passes under Russian control. So this is the start of a process. It is not the conclusion of a process, and one shouldn't behave as if it was. Secondly, there was a meeting of a sort, an agreement of a sort, which is not to be discounted. It was a meeting to exchange prisoners, and on humanitarian grounds alone, that arguably justified the meeting in Istanbul. Thirdly, and this is of course an absolutely key point, we've gone from a position where Ukraine was rejecting negotiations outright. It is now finally negotiating, and negotiating directly with the Russians, despite Zelensky's October 2022 decree, and that must be considered a breakthrough. This is something that I talked about in my previous program. Anyway, there we go. So what can we expect from the Trump-Putin telephone call today? Well, the Russians, over the course of the last 24 hours, have again gone out of their way to make it clear that their position remains the same as always. So yesterday, an interview appeared which Putin gave to his favorite journalist, Pavel Zarubin, in which essentially he restated his well-known positions and said also that he believes that Russia has all the resources it needs to bring the special military operation to a successful conclusion, fully achieving all of the objectives that he set for it when he launched it in February 2022. And to repeat, these are denuclearization of Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, what the Russians call denazification of Ukraine, which means obviously the elimination of the political influence of the holders of the far right ideology in Ukraine, the protections, civil protections for Russian speakers in Ukraine, and restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. All of these are positions which the Russians say have been insisting that they want to achieve. They also want Ukraine to become again a neutral, non-aligned country. The Ukrainians, as I've discussed in multiple programs, appeared to concede, most of them, at the Istanbul meetings in March 2022, resulting in an agreement, a draft agreement, which their negotiators initialed. And, well, that remains the Russian position. And Putin reiterated that this is so, except, of course, that in addition to what was conceded 3 years ago in Istanbul, Putin now insists that the entirety of the territory of the four regions must be transferred to Russia, and that Ukraine must recognize the fact. It must recognize that the four regions plus Crimea are legally part of Russia and not stand in the way of other countries doing the same. So that is the Russian position. Putin, well, he didn't set it out in the way that I have just done, but you could tell from his interview that essentially he's sticking by that, and he expects and believes that Russia has the resources to make it happen. So that was what Putin said. The Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, who is currently, by the way, in St. Petersburg, and who attended the same forum as I have been attending, though we did not attend the same panels, and I haven't seen her. Anyway, she is reported by TASS as saying essentially the same thing. She's saying, in fact, she has explicitly said that the Russian position essentially remains the same one that Putin outlined in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June, 2024. So this is what Putin has been saying. It is what Zakharova has been saying. I cannot imagine that Putin is going to retreat from that position when he talks to Trump. So if Trump still believes that he can get Putin today to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, he's going to be very disappointed, because Putin won't. After all, Putin has already rejected that idea, which he did over the course of a previous telephone conversation with Donald Trump, the one which took place on the 18th of March. Given that the Russian army is advancing, and is advancing further and faster than it did during the conversation between Putin and Trump on the 18th of March, Putin is under less pressure and has less of an incentive to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire now than he did on the 18th of March, when he rejected that idea. And it makes absolutely no sense, therefore, to expect that this time he will accept it. So, given that this is so, what are Trump and Putin going to talk about? Well, obviously, Trump wants a meeting with Putin. And I think that Putin might tell Trump that, yes, they might as well have a meeting. From a Russian point of view, the meeting has not been thoroughly prepared, not even close. It's not at all clear to me what possible agreements have been sorted out between the two leaders, which would, in conventional terms, make a meeting between Putin and Trump worthwhile. So, normal diplomatic practice might argue against the Russians agreeing to a meeting between Putin and Trump today. I think that there is nonetheless a possibility that Putin will agree to the meeting. This is not because Putin is stringing Trump along. As I discussed again in my previous video, if Putin was stringing Trump along, he would not be telling Trump the same thing that he has been telling Trump and the Americans for, weeks now, months now, in fact, which is that Russia will not agree to an unconditional ceasefire, be it for 30 days or longer, that Russia will stick to the positions that he outlined during his speech to the Foreign Ministry of the 14th of June 2024. The Russians would instead be giving evasive and cynical and duplicitous replies, giving the impression that they're prepared to agree to some sort of ceasefire or some kind of modification of their positions without actually, of course, doing so. The Russians have not acted in that way at all. In all their interactions, both with the Ukrainians and with the Americans, the Russians have been straightforward and direct and blunt, and they've said it, as far as they're concerned, as they are. So what Putin would probably want to do if he were to have a one-to-one meeting with Trump is do what he probably feels he cannot do over the telephone, which is to make Trump understand this and to understand that harping on the subject of a ceasefire at the moment is not going to move the talks forward. It is not going to bring us closer to peace. It could instead bring about the collapse of the talks if rumours and threats of additional sanctions from the United States come true and we start to get these sanctions, especially if they take the form of the bone-crunching sanctions that Lindsey Graham has been talking about, then not only will the war not end, it will be further prolonged. The Russians will have more incentive to double down on a military outcome. And that could lead to the final collapse of Ukraine and potentially to a complete rupture in relations between Russia and the United States. On all of these points, Putin will be mirroring some comments that have been made by the vice chairman of Russia's Security Council and the man who was previously president and prime minister of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who has said as much, who has said that in the event that the negotiations in Istanbul fail, then we could be looking at an all-out war situation with the Russians committed to seeking a military solution, and in Ukraine, showing no further interest in negotiations and no further interest in improving relations with the United States or with any part of the West. So that's, I suspect, what Putin will try to say. And he'll try to get Donald Trump to understand that. These are points that are probably very difficult to convey over the telephone. They might finally get through over the course of an actual one-to-one meeting, particularly if the summit does result, as I suspect it will, given Trump's style, in a one-to-one meeting between Putin and Trump without the major delegations being there. I think that Putin, and here, by the way, I agree with him, is probably concerned that a lot of the information about the status of the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and about the the Russian position is being filtered to Trump through people like Marco Rubio and General Kellogg, and of course by the European leaders, who are constantly telling him the Russians aren't serious, they're not agreeing to a ceasefire, and that proves that they're not serious, that they're just stringing you along, that they're not really interested in negotiations, that they're not interested in a final settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, that they are wanting to take over all of Ukraine completely, things of that kind, and also that Russia is weak, that if you push Russia hard enough, if you impose all these bone-crunching sanctions on Russia that Lindsey Graham has been talking about, then the Russians will indeed cave and you will be able to get all of the things you want. Now, as to the last point, the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, who has played a very active role in trying to influence Trump in a, as the Russians would say, anti-Russian direction, has been going around saying exactly that very thing, that Russia is not a great power, that it is weaker than it looks, that all you need to do is push Russia hard and it will break. It's not a power comparable to the United States. All it needs is one more shove, one more kick on the door, and the whole house of cards, which is Russia, will come tumbling down. So Putin will want to meet with Trump, this is my own guess, in order to convey to Trump that all of this information that he's been given, all this advice that he's been given, is simply wrong. Russia is determined to see this thing through. This isn't just Putin, it's Russian society as a whole. The Russian economy is stable. The fact that it is experiencing a slowdown this year is not because it is in crisis. It is because inflation got too high last year and because the central bank, by raising interest rates, is doing its job and is bringing inflation down. And that means that it has to lower the growth rate of the economy in order to achieve it. So I think this is what Putin will probably want to do. I'm going to make a guess that Putin and other Russian officials must be increasingly exasperated at the difficulty they have in conveying this message to Trump. Putin has on 3 occasions tried to do so by explaining his position fully and thoroughly to Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff. But the fact that he refused to receive Steve Witkoff 10 days ago, said to Steve Witkoff, look, I don't like your 22-point plan. I don't really think there's any further point in you coming to Russia at all. I think this is a sign that Putin feels that even Witkoff is not effectively putting across what Putin is saying to Donald Trump. And on some of these points, by the way, I think I can now, at least to a degree, a limited degree, corroborate their truth. I've said previously at the start of this program that the Russia I am visiting does not seem to me to be on the brink of any kind of economic crisis. Admittedly, I've only been here a few hours. It's not possible to give a complete view about the situation across this enormous country, but it doesn't look to me like a country that is on the verge, on the brink of an economic collapse. That's the first thing. The second is that, as I said, I have been attending panels here in St. Petersburg at the Legal Forum, and my own sense is that there has been a stiffening of resolve within Russia. I don't know how far back it goes, but certainly it looks that way to me. At the panel which I attended, one of the Russian speakers actually said that the time has come for Russia to stop being quite as accommodating and as measured in its responses to comments and actions that the West has been taking. It's time for Russia to act more strongly, more vigorously, to defend not just its interests, but those of the global majority and of international law. He was speaking specifically about this concept of the so-called rules-based international order, which we have been hearing so much about. And this speaker said, why has Russia been so slow in coming out and saying that this concept is wrong and fundamentally flawed and must be rejected? Wouldn't it have been much better for Russia to speak up much more forthrightly on this issue, as on many others, from a long while ago? And I could sense, and remember, he was speaking to a mostly Russian audience, not an exclusively Russian audience. There's people from all over the world attending this forum. Anyway, I could sense a mood of strong agreement with him. So I think that is why Putin will probably want a meeting with Trump. As I said, that is not a guarantee that it is going to happen. Putin may decide otherwise. The Ukrainians are said to be very, very nervous of a meeting between Putin and Trump, perhaps because they worry that Putin will make exactly the kind of points that I've said that he might do, and that Trump might be receptive to those points. Anyway, we shall see. Now, a number of further things we know about this forthcoming meeting after call between Trump and Putin. We know that after speaking with Putin, Trump intends to call Zelensky. Now, there's been an interesting development about Zelensky because on Friday, Trump also spoke with the various European leaders who all gathered in Duran, where they welcomed Zelensky with open arms, with hugs and handshakes and all of that, after he flew to Tirana from Ankara, where he'd had his 3-hour meeting with Erdogan, a 3-hour meeting which I still don't wholly understand, the purpose of which I still don't wholly understand. But anyway, Trump spoke to all of these leaders, Macron, Starmer, Merz, all of them. And apparently they all said to Trump that the Russians aren't serious, that they're stringing him along, that they're not agreeing even now to the 30-day ceasefire, and all of that. But apparently several of the participants in the call, and we're getting this from the media, was struck by how subdued and tired and depressed Zelensky appeared to be. He came to Albania, to Tirana, a defeated man. He hadn't wanted talks with the Russians to begin. He's actually got a decree to forbidding it. He absolutely did not want talks with the Russians to begin without a ceasefire being achieved first. He's been pushed aside. The talks between the Ukrainians and the Russians have begun and have taken place, and there will be more talks coming, and there is no ceasefire. So he came to the meeting apparently tired and despondent, and he was not the usual theatrical, fiery, stubborn, angry Zelensky that we so often see. So Anyway, we will see where this goes, whether there will be a meeting between Trump and Putin. I cannot see what other outcome there can be. I am going to make a guess that one of the reasons for Donald Trump's optimism is precisely because he now expects the Russians to agree to a meeting. He's got no other grounds to be as optimistic as he currently sounds. Perhaps he doesn't understand why the Russians are prepared to meet with him. But anyway, we shall see. So let's take a step back and wait to see what happens. Meantime, the military situation on the battlefronts, as I said, continues to tilt ever further in Russia's direction. Now, I'm under heavy time pressure, so I am not going to devote my time today to a military summary. I will simply say briefly that Ukraine has resumed its attempts to try to break through into Kursk region to capture the village of Tetlino. The head of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the most elite brigade perhaps of the Ukrainian army, has either resigned or been sacked. Perhaps because of the failure of this attack in Kursk, I'm not absolutely sure. Certainly some senior officer of the 47th Mechanized Brigade has resigned, appears to have resigned, complaining of irrational and pointless orders and of the whole thing getting completely out of control. So anyway, the Ukrainians have been trying to do that. But to repeat again, everywhere else on the battlefronts, the Russians are continuing to advance. Russian drones now operate behind the Ukrainian lines, in some sections 40 kilometers behind Ukrainian lines, including in Kherson region on the west bank, the Ukrainian control bank of Kherson region. They're apparently an almost constant presence. We're not just talking now about surveillance drones, we're talking about strike drones. And there's been more commentaries and articles appearing in various places about the Ukrainians being massively understaffed and under-equipped and in no position to hold back the pending Russian offensive. So, logically, the Ukrainians should be keen to agree to negotiations and to a settlement, roughly on the lines, at least, that Putin has proposed. Skillful and intelligent negotiation by the Ukrainians might improve on those terms, by the way, but that's not how the Ukrainians have been going about it up to now. I wonder whether they can. Now, there is something else which I do want to say, which I've been told by someone from China. I'm not in a position to verify its truth, but it would make a great deal of sense to me that it is indeed true. And this is that apparently it is fairly well known and well understood in China that if European troops were inserted into Ukraine, NATO troops entered Ukraine and started to fight the Russians there, that China would not stand aside and that it would intervene in the war on Russia's side in some way. Now, intervention can take various forms. I don't think it's been suggested that the Chinese military itself goes all the way into Eastern Europe and Western Russia and starts fighting NATO there alongside the Russians. But what I do think is very likely to happen is that China will start to supply weapons, shells, artillery shells, drones, those kind of things, to the Russians on a scale that we have not seen in this war before. To repeat again, Russia may be outproducing the West, and by a considerable margin, in some types of weapons. But in the case of China, we are looking at something magnitudes different. I remember reading some months ago, I think it was in Asia Times, that China is able to produce up to, if it really commits itself to doing it, up to 10,000 cruise missiles of various types a week, which is greater than the totality of cruise missiles that the West has in its arsenal. So that gives one a sense and an idea of what might be coming. Now, to repeat again, I don't know that this is necessarily so, but I understand it's been actively discussed on Chinese social media. If people want to push back about this, they'd be welcome. I'd be very interested to see what people have to say. Anyway, there is one further point I do want to touch on. This is that apparently the American operation against the Houthis in Yemen did not go particularly well, and apparently at least one F-35, this is America's most advanced fifth generation stealth fighter jet, was almost shot down over the course of the conflict. Now, I don't know much about the kind of air defense system that the Houthis operate, but apparently it was formidable enough to give the Americans pause, and it decided Donald Trump against continuing with his military action. Well, if that is correct, and all the reports suggest it is, if the US Air Force could not suppress the Houthis' air defense system and risked suffering losses, what is it likely to be in a contest with the Russians in Ukraine, whose air defense system is orders of magnitude more advanced than that of the Houthis? And apparently there's been another long report, which I haven't seen, which makes similar points about the United States going to head in a battle against China in the Asia Pacific. This report apparently also says that the US Air Force would not be in a position to achieve air superiority over the Chinese Air Force. More likely, it would be the other way round. And again, I'm sure that that is true. One way or the other, we have, or so it seems to me, arrived at that point where American military power, America's vaunted Air Force, is nowhere near as dominant in global terms as it once was. And that is a major constraint on American actions. Now, let me just finish this program. And I'm sorry it is a short, quick program, by just touching on the other big news story, which is the election in Romania, which the Liberal candidate, Mr. Duran, won against George Simeon, the right-wing candidate, who was backed after having previously backed the previous right-wing candidate, Yascu. Now, I'm going to say straight away that this was something of an upset as far as I'm concerned. Simeon came a decisive first in the first round with 41% of the vote. Duran only got 21% of the vote. I'm told that Duran is an unimpressive public speaker, though I have heard exactly the same about Simeon, just saying. But nonetheless, given the difference between the two, I assumed that Simeon was a shoehorn to win. So the question is, why didn't he? Well, Simeon himself is saying that there was no malpractice in the vote, that the result we've got is the true one. If Simeon says it, I'm hardly in a position to disagree with him, though I can retain my own doubts. But the point comes, the point I'm going to make is that this takes us back to the previous video I did about the actually very real difference between George Simeon and Kali Yascu. Simeon may have somewhat opportunistically thrown his support behind Yascu, and given the appearance that he and Yascu were political allies. But in reality, there is actually a considerable political difference between them. And I would have thought that many Romanians who might be inclined to have voted for Yascu, who comes across to me as an erudite and scholarly man, and who is, by the way, I understand, actually a rather good speaker, they might have been a lot less keen in voting for someone like Simeon, who, let's put it this way, has a history of political agitation, which I can understand why it might put some people off. But there's another thing to play as well, which is that I'm not really convinced that Simeon would have convinced Romanians that if elected, he would have represented any real change. On foreign policy issues, where Yascu seemed to break through, my strong impression is that he was fed a lot closer to the NATO position than he liked people to believe. He strongly supports NATO. He strongly supports the EU. He referred just before the election to Vladimir Putin as a war criminal. Well, that may have fed into a perception that Simeon, who's been around in politics for some time in Romania, actually isn't such a big break from the remainder of the Romanian political class. And given the doubts that exist about him because of his previous record, that might have been enough to dissuade some people from voting for him. I'm not going to pretend that I'm a huge expert on Romanian politics. And again, I would be interested to know what people in Romania themselves have to say. But anyway, there it is. Now, this, I'm afraid, is where I'm going to have to finish today's program. As I said, I'm very, very busy. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a good day.